Okay, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on this, our third webinar with the Civic Commons Catalyst series. So this webinar is a conversation with the Winnipeg Boldness Project in Vivo for Healthier Generations. Super excited to have them. And we're focusing around participatory places. Today we hope you learn more about their approaches to enabling collective decision-making, creating places for resident empowerment, and building participatory cultures in their cities. My name is Ayana Webb. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a program manager at Evergreen. I'll be your host and moderator for this conversation. So welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to just go over some of the housekeeping items. So one thing is that you can ask questions at any point throughout the entire webinar. Please do so by putting those questions using the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen with a little speech bubble. So you will never have to unmute yourself. But you can write your questions there. If you have questions that need to be addressed in the moment, so if they're about what an acronym means or the definition of something that is instrumental to your learning, we will get to it as soon as possible and answer within the chat function, trying not to disturb the flow of the presentation. If it's a question that is for one of the speakers that is about the content of their pieces, we'll keep that till the end. And we will ask our speakers those questions after the second set of speakers on a first come, first serve basis, and likely with thematic groupings to make sure that questions that are related are answered at the same time. We've also asked you to send us questions ahead of time, and lo and behold, for the first time ever, we actually received some questions ahead of time. So we have 4 questions on deck to also ask. So one of the things to watch out for is that the webinar was booked for 75 minutes just to ensure that our session doesn't end abruptly on the hour, but the programming is scheduled for 12 to 1 p.m. Sorry, Eastern time. So don't be worried about us going over. We're going to stick to the time that we've allotted for it. If you're having any tech problems, please email jlafren@evergreen.ca. Not only is she the email address that you would have been communicating with and that you would have received your confirmation from, but she's also dropping her email address in the chat function. So you'll have it at your disposal if you need to email her, and she'll be checking throughout the webinar to ensure that all of your needs get met. Okay. So let me just situate you in the Civic Commons Catalyst before we get started. So the Civic Commons Catalyst is a new initiative of Future Cities Canada, which will offer an array of programming seeking to support and scale the Civic Commons initiatives to prototype new participatory models and to support resident-led activities. So you may be asking, what are the Civic Commons? So we've loosely defined it as the things that make our cities what they are. So libraries, schools, community hubs. The thing that unites that is that they serve the needs of residents, they offer public benefits and economic opportunities, and instill a sense of belonging, or some combination of those things. We believe that Civic Commons, if resourced properly and positioned properly, can do much more than that too. That they can foster a sense of engagement, that they can provide and support equity, and that they can really contribute to prosperous cities. So in our work here, we're doing 3 things. One of them is a learning network. The learning network also has this webinar series as the backbone of it, but we will be doing other things and hopefully be able to build robust connections among national partners working in this space in the imminent time. We have a lab. A lab allows us to take a challenge question that is sort of plaguing or challenging some of the community hubs that are working across Canada and find new ways to address it. So we are leading that as well. And then lastly, we have the community studio, which is more of a place-based opportunity to bring community organizations together to pilot and test public engagement processes and approaches in sort of an incubator space. So those are the elements of our Civic Commons Catalyst. This is a very high-level overview, but if you're interested in learning more, we will follow up with the website with more information there, and you can always reach out to me, which we will also include in the follow-up to be able to ask those questions. So thank you for joining us. I'm super excited to introduce our speakers, and I think this is going to be a really great show. So first I want to introduce Diane Hussein. She's a dedicated community leader and a proud member of Skowhegan First Nation. Diane has worked tirelessly over 2 decades, primarily in Winnipeg's inner city, with organizations and projects that respect the ability and the right of Indigenous families, children, and individuals to care for themselves and thrive. She's a strong believer that families must determine their own solutions in order to create sustainable and equitable change. Most recently, she became the project director for the Winnipeg Boldness project, a research and development project focusing on improving outcomes for children in the north end of Winnipeg through social innovation and social lab processes. Diane holds a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Social Work degree and sits on the board of director for both the Turtle Island Institute and the Winnipeg Foundation. In January 2018, Diane received the Governor General's Award for Outstanding Indigenous Leadership. Woo. She's a cherished member of a large extended family and a loving mother of 2 daughters whom she adores. Welcome, Diane. And I love how your bio is very full circle. Tracy Martin. So Tracy Martin's dedication to innovation started in the world of business development with Fortune 500 companies, to working with local government and now focusing on social innovation and collaborating with diverse sectors and communities to make systems change. Currently, Tracy is Senior Manager Innovation of Vivo for Healthier Generations, a charitable enterprise on a mission to raise healthier generations in Calgary and beyond. She loves to collaborate with others, co-create, prototype, measure, and scale solutions to the everyday challenges communities face. She is happiest pursuing the impossible to make a real difference in the world. And now that I've commented on the first bio, I feel like I have to say that this is also full circle. Thank you. And Chris Kelly Frere, as a manager of the Vivo Play project and senior innovation designer, Chris is currently supporting the transformation of a regional recreation center into a new next generation social infrastructure hub and movement. He also leads a hybrid public health research project and social innovation lab called Vivo Play Project. He's primarily interested in the craft of leadership and the development of adaptive and resilient communities. Previously a senior innovation designer helping to found the Civic Innovation YYC project at the City of Calgary, he focused on working to craft new channels for citizens to create with their governments. Along the way, his team nurtured adaptive tools and mindsets with the belief that government can and must do better. He appreciates the challenge of asking, how could I be a better ancestor as we tackle emergent and complex problems? Holding a master's degree in architecture, Chris was part of the core team that designed the experiences and operations for Canada's newest science center, TELUS Spark. He's an alumni of Leadership Calgary, the Banff Center, and has broad experience applying both design and strategic thinking at a range of scales. His work also includes an active art practice, community leadership, and critical writing. In another life, he was a tap dance instructor, sometimes coaches high-intensity rowing classes, and can't stop drawing. I really feel like I know who you are. So welcome Tracy and Chris from Vivo for Healthier Generations. So I'm really stoked to have all 3 of you here to share your experiences and really bring to light this participatory places and the potential that Civic Commons have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Diane, to get us started. Thank you. And though we tested this a million times, I can't hear you. And I don't know if I'm alone in this. Oh.
Still no?
Now we can hear you. Okay, take it away, Diane.
All right, I just said all the profound things while I was muted. Thank you for having, still? I'm looking at Chris. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Thank you for inviting Winnipeg Boldness to be part of your series and to be part of this webinar. We're always quite excited to share what we've been learning here in Winnipeg with our lab. And so I'll say next slide. I know I have to prompt the slide here. And so there's two things I think I wanted to cover in our time today, and it was to talk a little bit about the process that we follow, as well as to talk about some of the content that that process generates. That's sort of how I think about the work we do. And so this slide just sort of talks a bit about the process, I guess, or the platform that we're using, which is a social lab. And I know you mentioned that in your introduction there. And so for those of you who don't know, I mean, the real shortest description of that is that we are prototyping ideas for systems change, and then we're trying to figure out how it is we might scale our prototyping to have that impact on systems change. So we're situated in a particular neighborhood in Winnipeg that's affectionately known as the North End, but it's a little bit bigger than the North End. And so the official name of it is the North Point Douglas Neighborhood Characterization, is what the city of Winnipeg calls it. And so we're really trying to use the lens of early childhood development and early childhood and things that are happening for babies. But when I talk a little bit more about where we're drawing on that knowledge, you'll see that it's hopefully will get across to you that we're really centering Indigenous wisdom here in the project because of where we are and because of the neighborhood and because of the folks that are typically sort of talked about in this neighborhood. And so when we center Indigenous wisdom, when we think about babies, we think very holistically. And so a lot of what we talk about ends up being about families and communities, which I think is probably pretty commonsensical for most of us that are doing work with people. So, but just, people always ask about, what's the area we're in? So we always say that early childhood is the area. And when I will say that I think the question that some of the process that I wanted to talk about today was really how are we centering the Indigenous wisdom? How are we centering the community wisdom in all of what we do? And I will say, whether this is known or not known, that when we're talking about the babies and what's best for children, we very rarely, at least in Winnipeg, very rarely actually talk to the parents of those kids. And so there's a lot of experts out there. There's a lot of people who have spent their careers in this area. And quite often, folks like that have a lot of access, and folks like that tend to be invited into a lot of the conversations just because of their expertise and background. But the parents don't often get asked. And so that may be surprising. We are looking at what we would call mainstream sort of science around early childhood development, and that's pictured by the ECD, which is Early Childhood Development Science and Research picture there. And the other, what we're really focused in on is centering the community wisdom, which again doesn't often get tapped into, and it's definitely not written about, and it's definitely not documented as much. And so that's where we spend a lot of our time, is focusing on the community wisdom and ideas. So that's the other little image there of the thought bubble. So I will ask to go to the next slide. And again, this is just sort of a high level definition of what is a lab. And there's some steps to labbing. So like I said, it's really about prototyping and then figuring out how to scale. But I think the other underpinnings of a social lab is that we're really trying to bring together diverse people and folks that aren't normally invited into the conversation and bring them together. And the other underlying parts of a lab is that we're trying to address complex issues, not the low-hanging fruit. We're trying to address the high-hanging fruit. So that's that would be true for what we're trying to do here at Boldness. Next slide. And we have access to all of this information on our website. I know I'm going pretty quickly. This is a diagram of all the different groups that are involved with us, and it's really our attempt to try to show all the different folks and all the different relationships. I think when we're asked, how do you center community wisdom, this is how we do it. And so each of these circles and each of these bubbles would have a role to play, and they would have a place where they're taking a lead on something. And so it involves a whole lot of community meetings. It involves a whole lot of consensus making and sense making. And there isn't any one group that's sort of the decision maker. And it's even though I do have a board of directors, which we call our stewardship group, they still have a particular role. They're not the end all be all, and they don't get the final say in some of aspects of this project. There's parts where the community leads and the community gets to decide. And then there's parts where other folks, like in terms of submitting a legal proposal to a funder, like the stewardship group would be a part of that. So this is another question we get asked a lot, right? How do you center community wisdom? And so I would say that it's really highly relational, and it is about a lot of relationships. And it's understanding at what point does a certain group sort of be the lead or make a decision. So next slide. And there are community groups such as people who work in this neighborhood, who worked in this neighborhood for a very long time. There's parents who live in this neighborhood. There's, different communities, different services, I think, that have been in this neighborhood for quite some time. So the Winnipeg Boldness Project is 6 years in, but I would say that it is built upon a foundation of long-standing, highly trusting, intergenerational relationships that have been in this particular neighborhood for a very long time. And so we really built upon that. And that's part of, again, how we center the community wisdom in all of what we do, is recognizing and building on those long-standing relationships and learning from those relationships and continuing to work within those relationships. And so there's only 4 folks here at the Winnipeg Boldness Project who are employed by the Winnipeg Boldness Project. But we have so many community partners who are the ones who are actually implementing the prototypes and testing the prototypes and then scaling those prototypes. So it doesn't actually happen with staff. It actually happens with all of our community partners. Next slide. The other way we center community wisdom in this project is through our theory of change. And so this is a diagram that represents our theory of change. And so it's a wordle, and if you take any one of those words, it's a high set of principles, values, a way that I think our community is saying, if you work with our families and our kids in this way, then we're going to hit transformational change. And it would be really great if all of us, whoever you are, if we could all work this way, things would be way better for babies. And so all of our prototypes and all of our scaling activities are centered upon this theory of change, and building on these principles. Next slide. I'm going to go quickly, there's a minute left, but this is sort of a textbook definition of prototyping. Make it better for babies. When I got asked to be involved in this project,
We're getting a little bit of either interference or lag in your microphone.
To our community, I had to ask the community, what do you think it be? Okay, maybe I'm just talking too fast.
I think it's a tech issue. So I might just interrupt you to ask you to go back to the beginning of the slide, just because we didn't hear any of those pieces.
It said, well, this is just a technical definition of prototype. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Can you hear me? Next slide. There we go. So another way that we centered the community wisdom was when we were having the original discussions or the initial discussions around what's good for babies, we went straight to our community. And so there was a lot of experts who had a lot of ideas about what we could do to make it better for babies. And so there was a lot of discussion around literacy, numeracy, so on and so forth. And so as you can imagine, a lot of the, if that gets defined as sort of the problem, then the solution finding starts to really focus on that. And so we wanted to go further back and go back into our community and ask our community, what do you think it is better? Like, what do you think is we need to do to make it better for babies? And our community said a lot of different things other than literacy, numeracy. They were talking about belonging and identity and culture and language and, just sort of these foundational aspects of human beings. And so that ended up being where our solution finding was focused. And so, like I say, our community doesn't even often get asked what the problem is. And so, you know, then the solution finding starts following the folks who get to define the problem. So for us, it was really important that our community defined the problem. So here's a whole list of, big long list, next slide, of ideas that our community came up with and said if you could do these things. And so our prototyping is based off these ideas that our community said would be great for babies. And so sometimes when you look at the kinds of prototypes we're working on, which again are all listed on our website, people think, well, what does that have to do with babies? And the point of it is that our community said, this is what we want you to do in terms of working in our community to make it better for babies. So next slide. There's all the prototypes we're working on. Next slide. And we have examples of all of our different, and I'll just maybe get you to scroll through, like just so people can have a quick flash, just if you want to click through the next 8 slides or so. These are just examples of all the prototypes that we're working on right now. And the last thing I'll say, because I think my time is up, is to say that we've just centered the community wisdom in all of these prototypes. And so there's ways that these prototypes could be put together, lots of different ways, if we didn't involve our community, and we've seen that lots, and that's great. But for us, it's important to center our community, and the prototypes just take on a whole different direction and a whole different life form when our community is in the driver's seat. So I'm going to end there because that's my time. And yeah, there'll be some time for discussion after. Thank you.
And I think people might be really interested in digging into some of those meat and potatoes. So in the question period, we'll make sure to ask you about maybe what your favorite example of a prototype was and unpack that a little bit. So thank you so much, Diane, for that contribution. And let's go on to Tracy and Chris. I'll turn it over to you to talk about Vivo.
Thank you for having us today to join you. We're excited to share a little bit about the why of our lab, and then talk about, and Chris is then going to talk about sort of the process of bringing it to life, because it's really in its first year of Genesis. So again, we are very much open to learning and collaborating and figuring out this journey together. So we welcome the questions and thoughts and insights. In terms of Vivo for Healthier Generations, we are a charitable enterprise on a mission to raise healthier generations in Calgary and beyond. And it's really about how do we lean in and co-create solutions to everyday challenges that our community is facing at home, at school, at work, and at play. And then how can we take those solutions and share and scale them with others? Next slide. And our big why, what really drives us and pushes us forwards with a living lab in the heart of a community is, and we're situated in North Central Calgary. And North Central Calgary is really reflects the future of Canada. So it is young, diverse, and growing with multiple families. And it's a typical suburban Canadian community. And the other issue is our way of life is making us sick. So the design of our communities isn't making our community feel well. We're seeing more instances of poverty, more instances of social isolation. So how can we work with others to redesign or recode the thinking around our communities? And then our third issue that we're facing and working with our community with is our thinking is trapped in the present. So some of the work that we do has been very program based in the past, and it's no longer helping make a difference in people's lives. So how can we actually start to think in possible futures and look beyond the horizon of a 1 to 2 year impact and look at like a generational impact of 30 years. Next slide. So our so what for bringing this lab to life is really about how do we actually empower the communities to figure out and co-create the solutions they need to, and to be able to evaluate themselves so they can prevent the problems that they're facing in their own lives. So how do we really lean in and figure out what's happening with the community and figure out what the best solutions are together, and to be able to then to co-create those solutions with others and then measure if they're making an impact. Next slide. So the lab has 2 questions that it's looking at over the next 15 years in terms of exploring with the community. It's what are the ingredients to living a healthier life in a typical Canadian city, and what are the kinds of kids that we are leaving the planet, and what are the services that we can provide them to help them thrive, and how can we help them be actually to be the co-creators of those services versus us be that. Next slide. Then we started looking at, could we have a generational impact, and look at it in terms of a 30-year horizon, and could we affect individual behavior changes with our lab? Then could we affect environmental changes that are outside in the community? And then could we actually do some systems change by making some changes or shifts in decision making that happens at a government or institution level, and really looking at it in terms of what some of those outcomes could be, from the I, the individual or the family, to the we of the community. And you can see some of the impacts that we've listed there. Next slide. And one of the things that Vivo, because we're embedded in a community, we are able to work side by side with the community and partners to figure out what they think is best for their life, and to really prototype a lot of different solutions that could be in our living lab that we have as a facility or platform, then in the community, and then with others elsewhere. And we're able to kind of adapt and move a little bit faster than your typical government kind of institution or organization. And because we're working side by side with the community and partners, we're able to share those solutions then with government. And there's a trusted that we're helping to make a difference, and we're coming at it from a very humble perspective of wanting to do our best for families. Next slide.
All right, so I'm going to jump in and try to share a more specific example about what that means. Tracy, you can come into the screen. So the Vivo Play project is our organization's first fully scaled social innovation lab. What makes it unique also is that it's a hybrid Public Health Agency of Canada supported research project. We are trying to work over 4 years to actually test and validate and scale one of the change vectors that we've identified through the work through the community. So next slide. We know that right now, if you move to a typical Canadian suburb, in general, your life quality goes down. And that's because you spend more time in a car and you're socially isolated. So moving the dial on those two things, social connection and physical activity, is one of the best ways to help people live a good life. At Vivo, we went out to the community and we said, well, what does a good life look like to you? And folks said, it means being outside, playing across generations, our own way, without structure, maybe without equipment, in every season. And that diagram that's showing up on the screen shows really clearly like our simple theory of change, which is that when you add social connection and physical activity together, you can call it play, and it tends to make life better. And so over the next 4 years, we're working to center around our community's voice and their vision for living well, and to help them live that playful life. Next slide. Our goal over the 4 years is to create positive 10% shifts in 4 key areas. How much we move, so that's dealing with physical activity and sedentary behavior. How we connect across generations, we call that intergenerational socialization. So in normal language, that's making friends of every age. Social connection, which is how much we connect with others, and spontaneous outdoor engagement, which is how much we play outside. All of those technical terms are part of our partnership with the federal government, the Public Health Agency of Canada, who helped us define the evaluation that sits behind all of the change initiatives that are a part of this project. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into each of the individual pieces. You can visit vivoplayproject.com. I'll type it into the bar in a moment to see more information about the individual, we call them project engines inside of our lab. But a big piece of it is co-creation. So we're finding ways to bring elements of what some folks would call human-centered design, but also more future-focused strategic foresight into the community to create an environment where the community, just like the Winnipeg Boldness project, where their voice is at the center and their expertise is embedded in the most effective vector possible, so that you create an opportunity for those different ways of knowing to inform the actual programming you deliver. We're also training 300 play ambassadors over the next 4 years and spooling up 6 to 8, we call them play hubs, but it's sort of a network of places where people can be outside and play that aren't just equipment, that aren't just grass, that work in every season. And then working with post-secondary partners to measure and evaluate the impact. There's a technology component. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the deliverables that we're working towards. But we have 500 kids and families who will be a part of this project. They're currently being onboarded. We're in month 7 of 48. And those 500 kids and families actually get access to more information about how their lives are changing. And that's another piece of our theory, which normally public sector work tends to say, experts go off, they do research, they figure out what everyone should do, then a campaign is generated and programs are developed and those are delivered and then nobody uses them. Our theory of change is really to say, what does a good life look like? Talk to the community, help them live that good life, and then show them the change. And so the project includes some tech dashboards. Those 500 kids and families, if they want, can wear wearable devices that give them a live prediction of their current chronic disease rates. There's some, like, we're trying a lot of things all at once, but the core of the project is really to help people play so that they move more and that they connect. And then to generate the evidence so that we can start to fund in a sustainable way, play as primary healthcare instead of as the nice to have arts and culture. We go to the next slide. I wanted to show just a couple examples of some of the work that's happened over the last 7 months. This is a picture from an event we called Strategies for Playing in Suburbia. We took 50 community members, put them on buses, had them explore parts of their suburban environment they'd never been to. They built play experiences out of miscellaneous nonsense, traveled to another site, experienced prototypes other people had developed, and then came back for a symposium where we collected and understood their perspective and ideas. And that's informed a ton of our work around building the play hubs and developing our training. Next slide. This is an example of how you move from messy prototyping in the field into slightly more structured but still creative engagements that allow us to make the co-creation really meaningful. One of the cool things we've discovered is actually that it's possible to create co-creation experiences that people walk away from like they were just in a like a self like a, what would you call that, Tracy? Like they had taken a workshop. Yeah. Like they've offered to pay an immersion. They've offered to pay to come to our sessions. We do one about what are the ingredients to a healthy life. It gives us good data to design our interventions. And then they say, oh man, I would totally pay to come to that. It's like going to therapy, or it's like going to counseling as a family. We feel like we have a direction, which is really an interesting piece. Next slide. This is a picture of what our hubs look like. So it really is outdoor adventure play, open-ended, messy, full of all the good kinds of risk that build great brains. Again, I think we have a lot of alignment with the early childhood work that Winnipeg Boldness and a number of other organizations are doing. It seems like the health space is a really powerful space for Civic Commons to do social R&D. And then last picture. Actually, one more. Well, that was a picture of how we open our hubs. We go through them, a bit of a ritual where we allow the community to really take ownership and start to shift and change so that they remain the authors and the experts of the work that's in front of them. These are some youth that designed their own youth night and then spray painted all the shipping containers without incident. It was amazing. Last slide. But I wanted to land on this because we've really discovered that as much as this project is about play, and people often think play looks like something very specific, you know, kids with colorful objects running around, it can also happen around a campfire. And we're seeing that the act of both our process and the product of our work has created a new kind of space for dialogue that we think can have long-term impact. We're really excited that we have post-secondary partners to measure and baseline the work so that we can hopefully show the impact and build that case we talked about. But our biggest challenge might actually be to keep it simple and to make sure that we continue to deliver and advance in North Central Calgary. That's our story.
Great. Thank you so much, Tracy and Chris. Both are really wonderful examples of how community are brought into, and not just brought into, but who guide and direct the process of placemaking, of building the communities they want to see and building the activities they want to see in those communities. As I said, we have 4 questions at the outset. And this would be the time, anybody who's listening, to dump any questions you have into that chat. And I think I'm going to add another fifth question, which is, I think, Diane, we're all dying to hear what your gold standard prototype is. So maybe we can start there. And then while you're doing that, I'm also going to let you percolate on the next question, which would be key tensions in your work. And I'll add a little color to that later. So Diane, do you want to share what you thought was the best prototype or a great example of a prototype that came out of the work that you're doing with your community?
Well, they're all good.
Yeah.
I think the one that I like talking about, because I think it really can outline some real distinctions between when we center community wisdom and then when we don't. And so there was at one time, well, there still is an issue in Winnipeg and a lot in the North End around infant mortality. And so obviously that's a horrible issue in terms of babies, showing up at the emergency rooms, deceased. Like, that's just awful. And so, and the rates were higher in Winnipeg. And so, there was a lot of people wanting to do something about that, as do we. And so, there was this sort of push and sort of rush, because it's such an emergency kind of an issue. There was this rush to a solution called Baby Box. And so the Baby Box, called that a phenomenon, was cropping up all over Canada in all kinds of areas. And so the issue with the Baby Box, it's from Finland, it was the 1930s, and it's very much a part of Finnish culture, I think, today. And I think it was originally designed as a safe sleep surface, like it's literally a box, and babies sleep in the box, and that is considered a safe sleep surface. So part of the infant mortality issue was identified that it was unsafe sleep surfaces. So there was this sort of rush to the Baby Box concept, and we went to our community and said, okay, and there's lots to be said about how that Baby Box has been coming to life in Canada. And some of that's good and some of it's not very good. And so when we went to our community and asked our neighborhood, what would you do? What do you think of this concept of safe sleep surface, of the Baby Box, so on and so forth? And there was a whole great conversation that evolved over time. But where we got to in the end was this concept of baby basket. So our community said, well, the safe sleep surface is about keeping babies alive. We would like to raise the bar just a little bit higher and talk about thriving babies. And so the conversation became about, how do babies thrive? And so I think the Baby Box, the way it's sort of rolling out in Canada, the part about that raises flags for us is that it's highly transactional. You can go to a website, you can drop down box, you can order, you can sign up for a baby university, and then you're sort of really marketed with lots of product. So it isn't even necessarily what baby or family needs necessarily. It's about marketing a lot of product. At least that's the downside of what we've seen happening now. In our community, they said we need to be way more relational. So it's not so much about the stuff that's in the box, because right now the Baby Box does come with a lot of things that a baby might need in the first year of life. Our community said, let's be highly relational. It's more about the relationships that are surrounding the baby than about the stuff that's in a box, or the physical things that a baby might need. It's more about the relational aspect. Our community also said that, which became loud and clear, and we're seeing this in almost every single one of our prototypes, is they want a highly customized approach. And so the Baby Box is all about standardization and about putting the same thing in every single box, and economies of scale, so you can punch out a box for 6 cents or something like that with the stuff in it. Whereas our families were saying every family's different, their situations are different. Lots of our families it's not their first child. So what do you need when you have your first child, to what do you need when you have your second child, third child, and so on and so forth. And as you can imagine, given, there's a context of poverty around all of this, the things that our families were asking for were the things that are harder to get, such as double strollers or car seats, versus the stuff you can usually get for free. And our family said, we can get the free stuff. We know where to go in our community, like the food banks, what have you, to get, the baby formulas or the bottle or the whatever, like that. There's stuff that's easier to get that you can find all over the place. It's harder stuff, double strollers. You can't get that anywhere. And that's what they were asking for as a product, if you will, or a thing, in a baby basket. So what we did is we created sort of this big long laundry list of things that the family could just pick and choose. And so that's how we did the highly customized. So that's just an example. There's lots more to say about it, but that's when our community, when we ask our community, what do you think of this? That's what they tell us, which is very different than, again, the downside of what's happening with Baby Box in Canada is it just seems to me the marketers and the corporate sort of partners which tend to be a lot of American companies, let's say, are just really aggressive about pushing their product in our families. And so we've been pushing back on that.
Thank you for that. And I think you've actually segued nicely into my next question. And this is a question for both of you, but I think we can start with Diane so that we can kind of roll off of that last description. I think you've done a really great job of painting this picture of there are these solutions that are sort of packaged, but we're not about bringing packaged things and creating buy-in. We're about creating things based on the needs of the community that we're serving. And so I guess my question around tensions is, I've noticed in your diagram that you've placed, I love it because it's a hierarchy, but you've placed the community at the top and funders at the bottom. So the tension that I'm really interested in is that one is, how do you balance getting funding for the kinds of things that you're doing when you're quite intentionally placing funders last and placing community first? Do you see challenges in that? Is that a constant tension? What does that look like?
Yes, it is definitely a constant tension. So there's obviously all kinds of tensions around power and politics, and folks who normally get invited into the conversation and folks who don't normally get invited into the conversation. And when the folks who get invited into the conversation say different things, there's all kinds of tensions in that. I would say that for Boldness, what we're really proud of is the fact that we're centering community wisdom. And how do we do that? That's a process thing. And so to me, that's the most important thing about this lab and about the work we're doing. The solutions that are generated are really good, but those will change over time as will issues change over time. And so it's about setting up a really good process to tap into community wisdom. Unfortunately, it feels to me the tension is that most of our stakeholders and I guess funders, it's not just funders, but funders too, they want some tangibility. They want to know, what are you doing? And so they want the content, and they're not as about the process, right? They're like, well, what are you doing to make it better for babies? So they're very interested in the prototyping. And prototyping is just that. It's prototyping. It's testing and experimenting and trying. It isn't long-term outcomes, population level outcome change, which is what everybody wants. And so that's the tension, right? Is to show that you're tangible, to show that, the things that you're doing are important and have value. And this lab has an added value. I think this lab has an added value in that it centers wisdom. So many processes don't. And it allows our community to act in a way that's very conducive to the way that they act, which is the experimentation, the trying, the responsiveness, the trying something different and not being more interesting. And so that's what I think the lab does, which is a little bit unusual. I've been in the not-for-profit world, designing and delivering programs for a long time. And so we don't allow for a lot of risk. We don't allow for a lot of experimentation. We don't allow for trying and doing things differently. And so that's what I really like about the lab. The other tension that we're really struggling with right now is, we went back to a lot of our stakeholders to say, what should we do? Because we never intended to be a forever shop. Like we knew we were time limited. And so a lot of our stakeholders said, you need to keep going because you've really figured out how to prototype really well, which for me is, again, centering community wisdom in that. But that's only a part of the way there. I think most of our stakeholders feel that impact is going to be reached through scaling activities. And so we've had to take on the concept of scaling and figure out, how do you do that? Because it looks very different for every prototype, and there's lots of different concepts of scaling. And so, but I think most people are associating impact with scaling. So we're struggling with that right now. That is a tension right now about prototyping. Maybe, I don't know if it's versus scaling, but like, right?
Yeah. Yeah, great. That's, I think, a great response. And I also see Chris and Tracy furiously nodding at everything that you're saying. And I think you've really highlighted the need to shift based on the resources that are available to you. And so adding on this entire area of work, because scaling is work and sometimes harder work than the actual prototyping, or different work than the actual prototyping. So I saw a lot of nods with Tracy and Chris. So I'm wondering, did you experience similar tensions? Is there another tension that is sort of connected into the idea of prototyping needing to demonstrate that impact and needing to maybe even front load the process of co-creating a prototype with an intuition as to what that prototype might end up being?
We were having a conversation about this actually just before we started, because so the Vivo Play project, primary funder, Public Health Agency of Canada, which means that you have to submit a 4-year budget like 3 years before they give you the project. So Vivo, I've been here for 7 months. I've known this organization for a long time, but most of the parts of our project were designed very thoughtfully in partnership with Mars, actually, and Inaweave. They were designed together to submit as a kind of like a cohesive social innovation, social R&D research project. But we're going through this magical tension in our first year of people like, great, how are you advancing the deliverables? And the team is trying to say, well, we're still trying to understand what the community needs. And they're like, well, but the answer is play. I'm like, yes, but so that really interesting tension of how do you make measurable impact while you're still literally doing the sensing and detecting that you need to do to understand how to root and embed the work effectively in the ecosystem in which you're acting. Because, we have a theoretical project that sounds great, like play, increases social connection, increases physical activity, everybody gets better. But the nitty gritty of doing that in a 1990s Lupin cul-de-sac community that has 44% self-declared visible minorities, where we find out that most of the people don't own mittens, or in a 1970s community that's full of newly renovated infills where every parent is working 8 to 6. Those are both in your catchment area. And so we have this, for us, we are playing in that, we're doing that dance between prototyping and then scaling. And I just was saying to Tracy that the other thing that often comes up is, how do you tell a funder that you're not the right one to scale? Like when you have a discovery trying to build in pipelines and pathways, and I think we have a nice place because our primary deliverable is the evidence around our project. That's one of the key deliverables to one of our funders. So we get to go back and say, we're going to share the knowledge, and that's going to be the way that we can then bridge towards scaling. And then we have other funders, though, who actually they care about the 11,000 participants. They care about connecting into a certain number of schools. They care about a number of these key touch points. And so we have to make sure that we're doing a lot of really effective storytelling to take them on the journey with us, and to lean on developmental evaluation practices to make sure that we're capturing the forks in the road we didn't take, and to be able to offer reason for why, hey, we're not scaling this yet, or yes, we are taking ownership over this, or hey, we're bringing in a new partner that's in a sector we didn't think about before. So I think that's been an interesting tension. Tracy, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I would say another organizational tension that we've had in the last 18 months was that we were doing some of this the co-creation and the social innovation, and it was done with 2 people in the organization. And we realized we need to be true to what we were doing in one part of the organization. We needed to have that happen across the board, what we were doing, to be able to say, like, we say that we do co-creation, we say that we do evaluation, we say that we do prototyping, then everyone has to be able to do that versus just a couple. So we actually had to flip the innovation area from being a sidearm of our organization to being an actual one of the largest arm of our organization. So we went from 2 employees to just over 100 in the last 18 months. and that everyone is committed to embracing that lab framework and that lab process of bringing things to life. So that's been an interesting tension when you have people who have to learn how to lean in and work with the community and to do things differently than they. And we've had to make some hard calls with people and be able to say we need to find different types of perspectives and lenses to do this work as we go forward, to be true to their voice as a platform and being able to deliver on the things that we said that we would. So that's been a huge organizational shift.
Can I add to that? I think this is a really interesting pattern that I've observed in the social innovation field over the last few years, which is that labs often become catalysts for mindset change in larger organizations, which means that the burden of change management, if it's not effectively sort of corralled, can then suddenly also fall on the lab's shoulders, which can burn out the staff and interfere with some of the core pieces of the work. I'm seeing you nod. Diana. Do you want to jump in?
You're muted. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
You're good.
Well, Boldness, there's only 4 of us, and so we have to work through community. But prior to Boldness, I was the executive director of an agency that had about 180 full-time staff, and that was there was part-timers and all kinds of contractors. We went through a whole organizational change process, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah,
I will say that in the social lab process, because it's collaboration and you're bringing together so many different sectors that don't often talk to each other, that's a lot of work. I mean, collaboration, we can all say that, partnership, we can all say that, but doing it's relational, it's highly relational, it's high touch. It takes, like, you're often the translator, right? Because people use that community, we all use that word. It means so many different things to so many people. So you're often navigating, weaving, translating, brokering.
Yes.
Yes, very much so. And we started off with a lot of relationships, and now we're down to 3 to 5, just because that was another tension, was who really wants to do the work and put their heart and mind and soul and resources behind it as a partner, and then who wants more the glory of it. And we found there's a lot more people, a lot more partners that want glory versus putting their heart and soul into it. So we've been, we have a really vigorous, robust process in terms of like who we want to work with and why we want to work with them, because it's really important to be able to progress things and advance things, to have the right partners on board.
And to kind of build too on this topic a tiny bit more, part of the social lab process, like you're saying, it changes people's brains. It creates a new kind of permission space in an organization. It opens up dialogues that don't happen before, which means you also uncover the dirt. And so we've had a number of moments where, like, a previously you can see I'm like feeling with emotion, where like a previously very command and control kind of structure in an operationalized rec center was hiding some problems. And then you insert a team that grounds itself in empathy and safer space and focusing on like coalescing around a community voice. And then all of a sudden, like, you realize that you have to just pull apart everything and like restructure all of our brains, which is, I would love someone to do a PhD. Labs and organizational change, and you add funding to that, like a contingency budget for change management.
Yeah, who knew that your work was so rife with tensions? I really walked into something by asking that question. Thank you for that. I think that was really colorful. We have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left, and I want to get to this because it was a question that was asked ahead of time, around how do you specifically wrap in children's perspectives and involve them in the process of co-creation, but also evaluation and budgeting. So knowing that we have maybe 45 seconds each to answer this question, go for it. Let's start with Chris, because you were talking last, Chris and Tracy.
Yeah, sure. So we try to design, we lean on the fact that we're an organization that already knows how to serve families, to create family-centered co-creation experiences. So taking things like human-centered design tools or strategic foresight tools and making them accessible with plain language and in a facilitated environment where you have folks who can do sense making, who can take a family's ideas or a 4-year-old's ideas and put it on an even playing field or on a comparable playing field with the expertise from someone from the city. Not saying that you should only prioritize one or the other. This is a challenge for us in a really tangible way. We offer free childcare during our co-creation sessions. We involve the kids in that. We make sure that we do the planning and the development work out. Yeah, we do it out in the streets, in the community, because you make different decisions when you're surrounded by toddlers than you do when you're sitting in a boardroom. And in the evaluation piece, we haven't yet figured out a way to directly involve youth in doing the evaluation work. We're really interested in peer-led research right now and trying to figure out how we take ethics-approved instruments and train young people and other folks in different generations to actually do the research work themselves. We think that's probably the frontier for us.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think this is an ongoing struggle from a lot of different community hubs to engage children. Diane, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say ditto to so much of that. For us, and again, at the core, I think out of all of our prototypes is trying to figure out how to do family-centered work. Because, we program for youth over there and the children over there and the mom over there and the dad over there and the elders over there, and so trying to bring it all together. And there, in some ways that can be quite simple, but it's interesting how we just don't do that very often, and creating places and spaces and processes for family-centered work. And then I think with children, we try to show up at the places where kids are, and we try to create lots of interactive kinds of tools or techniques. We show up at the barbecues and we have the big sheets of paper for drawing, and we have lots of bubbles, and and you just find different ways to try to what do children think are important. Lots of this stuff, but lots of visual and play, like a lot of playful things, right, like that. So I think those children express themselves a lot. So yeah, very similar.
I love that, and I love the idea of being able to take what children think are important and then being able to articulate it on the same playing field as other people, because I think there is a lot of depth in the values that are deeply held by children, but if articulated in the way that children often articulate things, they can get lost in a larger process of co-creation. So thanks to both of you for, I think, a rich discussion and for playing off of each other. And thank everybody in the audience for joining us. So with that, I want to close quickly because we are at 1:01. Our next webinar is on Tuesday, September 17th, 12 to 1 p.m. I hope all three of our speakers and our audience are able to join us again then. This one is going to be also a very exciting one. It's a follow-up to the September 11th TD Speaker Series conversation exploring the role of public assets in building opportunities for resident participation and belonging within cities, and really specifically the mechanisms available to build, enhance, and protect spaces where that happens. We're going to be asking Ajiv Bhatia from the Center for Connected Communities to showcase and unpack some of the clips from Eric Kleinenberg's talk to frame a conversation about how we create places for people to flourish. This webinar will also be hosted and moderated by me. And I'm sorry, I should say Eric Kleinenberg's and Tamika Butler's, apologies. We'll be sending a follow-up email with information on how to stay up to date on our upcoming webinars, how to be engaged in future ones. We'll also include all of our contact information, as well as the websites that our speakers have offered through the chat in that follow-up email. Continue to follow us monthly in a series of these sharebacks from Civic Commons daring to do things differently and leading the way with unique participatory initiatives. Upcoming topics still include building community assets and leveraging old infrastructure. So that's our October conversation with Entremise in Montreal and UDON Enterprises in Cape Breton. And then moving from consultation to co-creation in November, which I think we can also draw a lot from our speakers today on. If you're interested in being showcased, we really want this webinar series to be for Civic Commons, but by Civic Commons. So reply to our follow-up to let us know if your organization is doing something really cool and get in touch to explore your involvement. So thank you everybody for making this a wonderful opportunity. Love to stay connected, and we'll involve you in the next iteration of everything we do. Thank you.